Gordon, we welcome you to the John Carter Brown Library to celebrate the publication of this magisterial book, Empire of Liberty. You begin with Rip Van Winkle. Why did you choose a fictitious character to begin your work?
Well, that's a famous story by Washington Irving, who wrote it during the second decade of the 19th century. And I think Irving he's a conservative sensibilities. He was responding to the extraordinary changes that had taken place in his own lifetime. So he tells this story of Rip, who falls asleep, wakes up 20 years later and walks into his town and everything's changed and he's in awe and confused. And I think that was Irving's way of telling this, telling his public what had happened. And of course they responded to the story. It's the most popular of Irving's stories. And it's picked up by the actor, Joseph Jefferson, who's an American actor. Through the 19th century, he gives 5,000 performances. I mean, through the whole century of Rip Van Winkle. And it goes to show you that the changes were occurring every generation, and Rip's story captured, I think, for Americans, the extent of that change.
We've all been disoriented since the beginning. Was it hard, as a historian who's done most of his work in the 18th century, to suddenly go 15 years into the 19th century?
No, actually, that was the source of much of my thinking, was the fact that I was trained as a colonialist, understood what the 18th century was like, and as I got into the 19th century, I realized that enormous changes had taken place in the way people were elected, in the way life went on, that it's because I had been trained as a colonialist that I could appreciate the changes.
So the period of this book is only 24 years, 1789 to 1815, but perhaps more change in any 24 years of our history. What were some of the profound changes?
In every way. In politics, you go from a society in which people stood for election to where you have a modern competitive system with political parties. In religion, you go from a very staid religions, organized, established churches or quasi-established, to evangelical fundamentalism of the sort that we're familiar with. In culture, you have an extraordinary transformation from the neo-classical kind of art to a kind of popular art. In all realms, college rioting. There was more college riots in this period, 1798, 1808, than in any time in our history. I mean, colleges would close down for weeks at a time. Nassau Hall in Princeton was burned. There was just incredible kinds of rioting, drinking, the highest consumption of alcohol. We reached that point, 5 gallons per person by 1815. The little town of Peacham, Vermont, had with 1,500 people, had 30 distilleries. This was a drinking nation, which of course encouraged the temperance movement. So by every measure, this was a period of extraordinary instability and change, demographic as well as cultural and social.
I trust none of this bad behavior was taking place on this campus.
Oh yes, Brown was very much involved.
Oh, really?
Yes, it had one of the riots in the period.
Did writing this book from Rhode Island, a very small state, flavor any of your ideas about the federal system and how difficult it was for it to become a system?
Well, I do mention Rhode Island was, of course, slow to join the Union and was always odd man out in many respects. So I had that peculiar perspective on the period coming from Rhode Island.
There are so many heroes of the period, but there are a few villains also. Do you find them compelling as a writer?
Well, Aaron Burr is probably America's favorite villain. He's been written about, more plays, more novels about Burr than any other character. And he was the odd man out among these leaders. He committed what seems to many people to be treasonous actions, but he was let off by John Marshall in the famous trial.
Do you think we'll ever really know the full story of the Aaron Burr conspiracy?
No, we'll never know. We have all the data, I think, and we just never know quite what he was up to. He kept it, perhaps he himself didn't know.
It's nice to know that even with all of our historic resources, some things still remain unknowable.
Well, that's true.
The French Revolution, do you think it's important for students of American history to know its impact on our early story?
Oh, definitely, because it fits into a conception that we've continued to have. That is to say, we thought our revolution was promoting the French Revolution, had provoked it, and that we saw our role in the world fomenting democracy, fomenting revolutions everywhere, and that continued right up to our own time. I mean, that's what, presumably what President Bush was doing in Iraq. He was bringing democracy to the Middle East. We thought we were the harbingers, in the vanguard of history, with the harbingers of democracy throughout the world. And the French Revolution was the first example of that. So we were, most of us, most Americans, were enthusiastic supporters of the revolution, at least at the outset.
In the War of 1812, it's a war we are compelled to learn something about in high school history classes, but it doesn't get anything like the attention the revolution does. But we're approaching a bicentennial. Do you think we ought to know more about that?
Oh, I think so. It's an interesting war. It is probably the weirdest war in our history. The Capitol, we were invaded. The Capitol was burned. The White House was burned. But what's interesting, and Madison was condemned for that, President Madison. But what's interesting is not a single person was arrested for sedition. Not a single newspaper editor was accosted, even though a good part of New England was in open opposition to the war and to the administration, and was playing, was negotiating, in some cases, with the British. That is, they were committing treason. And nonetheless, Madison went through that war without any enhancement of executive authority, which he thought was what executives elsewhere in the world had done, monarchs had done, and he was not going to follow that route.
Well, this series, The Oxford History of the United States, is really the definitive series on our national epic, and it's a great honor to all Rhode Islanders and all alumni and students and faculty at Brown that you wrote this chapter. So thank you.
Thank you.